Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I will be discussing my take on a new commander from Theros Beyond Death, Dalakos, Crafter of Wonders. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to that down in the description too. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Dalakos is a 2/4 Merfolk Artificer for 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red. He can be tapped to produce 2 colorless mana that can only be used to cast artifact spells or activate the abilities of artifacts. Additionally, he gives equipped creatures you control flying and haste. This ability can allow for some interesting interactions, especially since any equipment that costs 0 to equip essentially gives a creature haste for free. This allows for mana dorks to tap for mana the turn they enter the battlefield, as well as creatures with tap abilities. Granted, you can achieve the same thing with Fervor, Akroma's Memorial, etc. without such a roundabout circumstance, but Dalakos also produces mana, so there's that to consider. Thus, this deck will seek to capitalize on all of Dalakos' abilities. The most forward way of doing so is with artifacts, equipment in particular. Being able to tap for 2 colorless mana is nothing to scoff at, since we can help cast equipment as well as pay their equip cost. For example, 1 activation of Dalakos is enough to both cast Skull Clamp and equip it. However, I'll discuss the equipment within the deck soon enough. This is a combo deck focused on artifacts, so it's important to first see how we'll dig through the deck in order to find the combo pieces. Joyrub of the Light Captain, Vedalken Archmage, and Riddlesmith all trigger when we cast an artifact spell. Jura has the added bonus of also triggering when we cast a legendary spell. Keep in mind that the Riddlesmith is a loot effect and not a plain draw effect, so it's also useful to pitch things to the graveyard. Speaking of which, we can also draw cards off of the ready Scrap Savant. His +2 is similar to a loot effect, but we have to discard first in order to draw up to 2 cards. Fortunately, his second ability allows us to reanimate an artifact by sacrificing another one. This can be any artifact too. We can sacrifice a Thopter token, Servo token, etc. and reanimate a costly artifact or combo piece that was destroyed by an opponent, or one that we discarded earlier on to cheat in later. His emblem is epic to have, but grindy to achieve. Once he closes in on 10 loyalty, he becomes an instant target of the table, so keep that in mind. Trading Post, Sai Master Thopterist, and Sage of Latnam also draws us cards, but we have to sacrifice artifacts to do so. At least of these, Sai doesn't require tapping, so he's only limited to how much mana we can dump into him and how many artifacts we have to sacrifice to him. Also, he creates Thopter tokens whenever we cast an artifact spell, which is a huge plus. Trading Post also has other abilities. We can also use it to gain life and recover artifacts from the graveyard, though it's mostly used to draw cards and recover artifacts from the graveyard. Another card to draw a bunch of cards due to how many artifacts we control is Shimmer Dragon. Since the ability is on the dragon, artifact creatures don't need haste in order to use its ability. Being able to just tap down 2 artifacts and draw a card at instant speed is an amazing ability. As a bonus, the dragon gains hexproof if we control 4 or more artifacts. Stroke of Genius and Blue Sun Zenith are amazing draw spells since you can sink a bunch of mana into them to draw into a significant chunk of the library. The deck does run ways of producing large amounts of mana that can be easily sunk into these X-costed spells. Besides drawing through the deck, we can also tutor for artifacts with Inventor's Fair and Tesseret the Seeker. The Fair requires us to control 3 or more artifacts in order to activate it though, which won't be a problem in this deck. Tesseret cheats artifacts straight onto the battlefield from the library. Fortunately, the deck does run 0-costed artifacts, which we'll see later, so you can use Tesseret to ramp. Besides ramping and tutoring for combo pieces, Tesseret can also be used to untap artifacts, which can be used on mana rocks or engine pieces. His ultimate isn't the main focus of inclusion, but if we do control a significant amount of artifacts and he has enough loyalty, we can activate that ability and storm the table with 5/5s for the win. Earlier I mentioned Skull Clamp as an example of what Dalakos can do, but Skull Clamp is an amazing way to draw cards in the deck thanks to all the 1 toughness tokens being created. Saheeli Sublime Artificer, Efficient Construction, Mirrodin Besieged, and the previously mentioned Sai Master Thopterist all create tokens when you cast an artifact spell. In particular, Saheeli creates one with any non-creature spell. What's great about these tokens is that they have a toughness of 1 for Skull Clamp, but they're also artifacts, so they trigger anything that cares about artifacts entering the battlefield as well as creatures. You can also use Saheeli to change any artifact into any other artifact, which is definitely a plus for artifact creatures and mana rocks. Brutaclad Telchor Engineer also creates tokens via a trigger, but it does so at the beginning of your combat step. Yet, besides creating that 2-1 token, Brutaclad also changes all tokens you control into a copy of whatever token you want that you control. This can get out of hand very quickly, especially if you have Helm of the Host on the battlefield. Let's say you had Helm of the Host create a token that's a non-legendary copy of Dalakos. Now all of your tokens can tap for 2 mana in order to cast artifacts or pay to activate abilities on artifacts. Or maybe you did something crazier like copy Brutaclad itself with it. At the beginning of your combat step, all of your tokens become non-legendary copies of Brutaclad. Then on your next combat step, all those Brutaclad copies make a 2-1 Mer, and you can then change them into copies of Brutaclad. That's some Sparta level madness right there. Nuisance Engine also creates artifact creature tokens for just 2 mana and tapping. They're 0-1, so unless they're pumped, they're chump blockers at best. That being said, they're also sacrifice fodder like the rest of the tokens in the deck. Mere Propagator can create tokens that are copies of itself, so with enough mana we can continue making more tokens afterwards. These are great since we can exponentially create more artifact creature tokens off of a single original instance. Pentavis and Thopter Squadron also create artifact creature tokens in a controlled fashion via activation. In fact, this is one of the many ways the deck achieves infinity. The easiest way is with one of these creatures, Dalakos and Intruder Alarm. Thanks to Intruder Alarm, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we untap all of our creatures. So let's see how this works. Let's say we have Dalakos, Pentavis, and Intruder Alarm in play. We tap Dalakos for mana. We use 1 of that mana to activate Pentavis, removing a +1/+1 counter and creating a Pentavite token. This token triggers the Intruder Alarm, untapping Dalakos. We then use the remaining mana to activate Pentavis, sacrificing a Pentavite token and putting a +1/+1 counter back on Pentavis. Notice that now we're back where we started. It's worth noting that you can also achieve this by equipping Dalakos with Thornbite Staff instead of having Intruder Alarm on the battlefield. Since the Pentavite token is being sacrificed, this would trigger the staff, untapping Dalakos. You can then do this all over again. This might not generate infinite mana or infinite tokens, but we do have infinite triggers. Combining this engine with Perforos God of the Forge, Reckless Fireweaver, and or Impact Tremors means that we just dealt infinite damage to the table. These 3 cards are also great in the deck without having to go infinite because, as just seen, the deck is constantly creating artifact creature tokens. We can also use these win cons with the other token generators mentioned like Nuisance Engine thanks to Karn, Silver Golem. Let's see how this works. We need Karn, Nuisance Engine, Dalakos, and Intruder Alarm. Use Karn to animate Nuisance Engine. Now, when you tap Dalakos to activate Nuisance Engine, creating a Pest token, the token triggers Intruder Alarm, untapping both Dalakos and the engine, allowing you to do this all over again. Unlike the previously mentioned combo, this one actually produces infinite tokens. You can also achieve this with Mere Propagator, but you'd need more reusable mana sources since Dalakos only produces 2 mana. So you can achieve similar results but using more mana dorks. Speaking of mana dorks, the deck's running a ton of them. Hedron Crawler, Mannequin, and Plague Mer each produce 1 colorless mana while only costing 2 mana, which is great since Dalakos is enough to cast them. Iron Mer and Silver Mer are 2 more 2-costed mana dorks that Dalakos can cast. Fortunately, these can tap for colored mana. Palladium Mer and Renowned Weaponsmith can tap for 2 colorless mana. However, the Weaponsmith's mana is restricted like Dalakos' mana. But Palladium Mer's mana can be used however you want and it can be cast with Dalakos' mana. However, Metal Worker is the best artifact creature mana dork in the deck. It can generate 2 colorless mana for each artifact you reveal from your hand when you tap it for mana. Since most of the deck is artifacts and you'll be drawing a ton of cards, there's a high chance you'll be generating a ton of mana from it. However, even Metal Worker pales in comparison to Urza Lord High Artificer. Urza changes all your artifacts into Mock Sack Fires. This is great since the deck has so many equipment. You can just tap them for mana no problem. You can also change the colorless mana dorks into Silver Mers. As a bonus, Urza enters the battlefield with a Mock Sapphire of his own that just so happens to be a huge beater. If that weren't enough, Urza is a mana sink that lets you cheat things off the top of your library. Storm the Vault becomes Vault of Gatlagan, which is an improved Tolarian Academy. This means that you can generate as much blue mana as artifacts you control, which means an absurd amount of mana with this deck, especially due to all the artifact tokens you can create with the deck. We can also maximize our mana usage thanks to Ethereum Sculptor and Foundry Spectre, reducing the costs of artifacts by 1 each. Better than mana dorks, these artifact creatures essentially give us a generic mana each time we cast an artifact spell. Burnished Heart is another artifact creature that helps accelerate mana by ramping for 2 basic lands. Not only can Dalakos help cast it, but he can also help activate it. Being able to ramp for lands is important since the deck does need colored mana to cast Dalakos as well as the other colored spells. Besides Mana Dorks and Mana Accelerators, the deck's naturally running a plethora of Mana Rocks. Mana Crypt, Mox Opal, Soul Ring, and Mana Vault are a given. The first two are free to cast and the latter costs only 1. Mox Opal's recent banning saw its price drop from $100 to $50, so hopefully more Commander players were able to get one so long ago were able to purchase it now. These Mana Rocks being so cheap is great for Tesseret to search for them in order to ramp. Speaking of which, Tesseret can also very easily ramp for Seed of the Signet, Great Furnace, and Darksteel Citadel. It's usually not advised to run artifact lands since you lose them to artifact hate, but they're good in a deck like this. When they enter the battlefield, they can trigger cards like Reckless Fireweaver. They also count for Vault of Calacan. They can be tamped down with Shimmer Dragon to draw cards. They're also free to cast because they're not really a spell, they just cost you a land drop. They can also be recurred if destroyed or sacrificed. For example, they can be sacrificed to Dereti in order to reanimate a better artifact, or they can be sacrificed to Quark Clan Ironworks. Doing so basically provides 3 mana since we can tap it for mana, then sacrifice it for 2 more. In any case, KCI is an obvious include in this deck in order to sacrifice artifact creature tokens to it for value or any other artifact in a pinch. On that note, Ashnod's Altar is also included for redundancy. You're limited to creatures, but fortunately all the artifact tokens being created in this deck are also creatures, so you can sacrifice them to either artifact to get 2 colorless mana. Thran Dynamo is the last mana rock of the deck. It might cost 4, but you can pay half of that with Dalakos. It enters the battlefield untapped and can tap for 3 colorless mana, so there's that too. Last but not least, Shuko is an amazing artifact in this deck, believe it or not. It's the cheapest way possible to give haste to all of our creatures. Granted, Dalakos has to be on the battlefield. Since our Mana Dorks have Summoning Sickness, we can't tap them for mana the turn they enter play, but we can equip Shuko for free and give them haste thanks to Dalakos. So if we equip multiple Mana Dorks in a single turn, we can just equip Shuko to each of them, tapping them down for mana each time. We can also do this with Lightning Greaves in case Dalakos isn't around. As I mentioned, since the secondary type of most of the cards in the deck is Artifact, it follows that the deck is weak to Artifact hate. This is why we have to take advantage of Dalakos' color identity and add cards to protect our board state. This is why the deck is running cheap counter spells like Pact of Negation and Swan Song. These help counter cards like Wave of Vitriol and Overloaded Vandal Blast, etc. The deck's not running Force of Will or Force of Negation because there aren't enough blue cards in the deck to guarantee being able to cast them for free. That being said, Negate, Counterspell, and Mana Drain are included for backup. Mana Drain is amazing here since it can give us some colorless mana to use during our next turn in order to cast spells, particularly artifacts. We can also recover any artifacts destroyed, sacrificed, discarded, etc. with Academy Ruins, Brewery Ruin, and Scrap Mastery. We can activate Academy Ruins in response to drawing a card in order to recover an artifact from our graveyard, or we can just activate it at the end of the turn before ours. Buried Ruin requires being sacrificed to activate, but it recovers an artifact as well as being a land, so it really doesn't take up a slot in a 2-colored deck. Scrap Mastery is perhaps the best one out of every card in this section. Maybe we weren't able to counter that mass artifact destruction spell, but Scrap Mastery is a living death for artifacts, so we'll be able to recover all of our artifacts in our graveyard. We can also protect our creatures thanks to Brass Squire. The deck is running plenty of equipment that grant Indestructible, Shroud, and Hexproof, so being able to switch them onto targeted creature is a great way to protect them. So it's almost like this Squire grants that ability to all of our creatures. This helps Hammer of Nazan, Darksteel Plate, and Shield of Kaldra gain even more mileage since we can attach it at instant speed in response to a creature getting destroyed. Fortunately, the Plate and Shield are indestructible themselves, so that's definitely a plus. Moving around Swiftfoot Boots and the previously mentioned Lightning Greaves is a great way to provide Hexproof and Shroud in order to fizzle any targeted effects aimed at our creatures. The deck also uses equipment to protect our combos. If we have Conqueror's Flail equipped to a creature, we can combo off during our turn without having to worry about being interrupted by an opponent. Since we're running blue, we can also be disruptive ourselves. A well-timed Overloaded Cyclonic Rift can really help us in a bind. If we get enough engines going and piling up value and generating synergy, we're going to be a huge target. So bouncing everything is a great way to protect ourselves. It's also easy for us to keep mana open for these responses thanks to Unwinding Clock. Being able to untap all of our artifacts each turn is amazing, especially since our Mana Dorks are artifacts. This is also insane when comboed with Shimmer Dragon. There are just so many things we can untap thanks to it that it's just crazy. It's also great when combined with Urza since he makes every artifact into a Mox Sapphire. The rest of the deck is just the lands. For colors, the deck's running Sulphur Falls, Steam Vents, Command Tower, Cascade Bluffs, Volcanic Island, Spire of Industry, and 7 of each basic land. It's also running all 8 fetch lands for color fixing. The last lands in the deck are Ancient Tomb and Temple of the False God. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Dalakos Crafter of Wonders. This deck is chock full of synergy and engines that can go infinite. However, if you don't like going infinite, you can still play this deck since the loops are controlled. You can stop whenever you want since it all depends on activation. There's tons of different ways to assemble engines that can do all sorts of things, so this deck is a lot of fun to pilot and play. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.